This recording will cover Chapter 5 in your textbook, Oral Language, Strategies, and Techniques. So now starting with Chapter 5, we really start getting into some specific techniques and strategies to teach students with high incidence disabilities. I'm not going to go into each one in a lot of depth because your textbook does a much better job than I do. So make sure that especially for, Chapter 5 on until the end of the textbook, make sure that you are looking at the textbook, reading the textbook, and really thinking about the strategies and techniques that they talk about in the chapters. Okay, so here, oh, I'm about ready to sneeze. Here are our learning objectives. Okay, we want to think about common problems students with HI encounter with oral language, and we'll talk about a couple of those. How language normally develops, how oral language influences reading and writing skills. That one, is pretty common, right? It's kind of everyday language. So the importance of oral language, again, oral language and its components, categories of language, and components of oral language. All of these are really, oral language is a lot more important than people think when we are teaching, and especially when we're teaching students with high incidence disabilities who might have limited oral language themselves, but they also might have some issues with oral language that is coming in also. So think about how much, if you're teaching now or if you're out in a classroom or in a school, think about how much oral language takes place on a daily basis, right? And if students are struggling with some of its components, they're going to struggle, right? They're going to struggle overall. So again, the importance of oral language, people think that oral language skills are developed naturally and that children just, come out knowing how to speak. But we know that that's not true, right? We have to teach young children how to speak. And then some of our students with high incidence disabilities, we still have to provide explicit instruction in oral language. So a lot of people also think, oh, that's just, that they're just a 3-year-old, they'll outgrow it. Well, not always, right? Especially for some of these students. So we want to make sure that we are being explicit and thoughtful with oral language and how it's used and how you all can teach components of oral language and encourage the use of oral language in your classroom. So you want to think about the sender and the receiver, who is sending the message and what are they saying, and who is receiving the message and how are they receiving it? How are they taking in that code, that information? And also, what is the intent? Right? Think about text messages or emails. You probably send a text message or an email that might be interpreted not the way you intended it. So we want to think about that, and not that our students, some of our younger students would necessarily be sending texts, but, our older ones certainly are. And especially for our students with high incidence disabilities, we have to make sure that they are clear with their intent of when they're sending messages or language, but also when they're receiving it. People tend to maybe read too much into a text message or maybe not read enough into it, or an email, something like that, and they might think that the intent is anger or, oh, I'm so mad at you, and really that's not the sender's intent at all. So these are things that we need to be clear about with your students, because these students in particular are going to struggle with stuff like this, okay? So a sender is the person who initiates communication through a message. Again, doesn't have to be, in this case, we are talking about oral language, but it could be even in a phone call, or also thinking of not oral language, a text message, an email, something like that. A receiver is the person who is tasked with interpreting a message sent by the sender, okay, that we just talked about a second ago. And then the intent, like I said, what a shared message is meant to convey. So you want to make sure that, especially with your older students, that they are understanding the intent of messages they are receiving, but also understanding their own intent when they are sending messages or sharing oral language or something like that. So components of oral language, I'm just going to kind of touch on this quickly, but again, your textbook goes into a lot more detail. Phonology is the system that defines each sound and the rules for how the sounds can be combined together. Morphology refers to how words are constructed from morphemes, which are, they should have included that, but a morpheme is the smallest linguistic unit that has meaning and cannot be broken down for further, or the unit, the word would lose its meaning. So example would be boy, okay? That's our word. If we add an S, that's a different meaning, right? Boys means there are more than one, or girl to girls, that S makes a difference. It changes the meaning. Okay, so keep that in mind. Syntax is a system of rules that determine how sentences can be formed and how to transform sentences into new sentences. Think about the English language, y'all. There's a lot going on out there, right? There's a whole lot of stuff for our little kiddos to learn, and it can kind of be overwhelming. So that's where you come in. Semantics is the meaning of language and involves the set of rules that determine whether certain words can go with other words and still make sense. And I'm sure, some students, especially younger students, even with or without disabilities, they just babble, right? They just make stuff up. They just talk and say words that they've heard. Doesn't always make sense, right? But as our students get older, especially the ones with high incidence disabilities, we want to make sure that they understand the rules that of how certain words can go together, so that when they are trying to communicate and share oral language, sending oral language, that they are making sense and that their intent might be a little more clear. Pragmatics is the use of language in social contexts and involves knowing the rules and skills for using language in social situations, which could be a struggle for some of these kiddos, right? Such as during conversations, in narratives, or situations when making requests and responding to requests, especially our students with autism, with intellectual disabilities. They're going to struggle with these components, okay? So that's why you need to be very explicit and really take the time to teach some of these skills. Some of your students will probably end up, or do have now, a speech language pathologist. Work with that person, work with your SLP, and really think about how you can infuse language in meaningful ways into everything that you do, okay? It shouldn't just be, 20 minutes with the SLP, they're going to get language. Well, no, it really needs to, especially for this, this group of students with HI, language needs to be all encompassing. There are some different models of language development. We've talked about the behavioral model, the psycholinguistic model, semantics cognitive model, and the pragmatic model. We talked about pragmatics and semantics a second ago. So how do I know when a child has a language problem? Is it just something that, they're 2 or 3 or 4 and they haven't quite grown into their language yet? When does it actually become a problem? And again, that's where working with your SLP will really be beneficial for those students, because the SLPs are more attuned to say, oh yeah, I can tell that this child has a language problem. Whereas me, as a special ed teacher, I can say, oh yeah, I can tell that this child has a disability, or this child might have autism, or this child might have this or this. But I'm not, as familiar with, oh yeah, I can listen to the student and interact with them for 30 seconds and know they have a language problem. So become friends with the SLPs in the building or in the district, however it works. Because again, language difficulties, there's going to be a lot of implications in the classroom for our students, your students who struggle with oral language difficulties. Could be any of these problems. Okay, so this one, again, oral language and reading and written language, implications for reading and writing. I mean, I don't think I have to spell this out to y'all, right? You can know how difficult for a student with oral language difficulties. Well, reading is going to be difficult, written language is going to be difficult, oral language, spoken language, everything is going to be difficult. There are a lot of implications for our little kiddos who struggle with oral language. So here's where we get into the strategies. I think the PowerPoint is about 5 or 9 slides. I think it means 1 of 9. But again, I'm not going to go into each one, but I want you to think about all of these things. How can you improve language skills in the classroom? What about creating opportunities for students to use communication skills? Snack time, something like that. Or if you are having center time, how can you encourage communication between all students? Some of them, maybe they might not have high incidence disabilities. Some of them do have high incidence. Maybe they use a, the name is escaping me, text to speech. That's not what I'm trying to say. Communication board. picture, something like that. So how are you going to create opportunities for all students to use communication skills? Lots of listening skills, lots of listening activities. Yes, this is kind of expected for our younger students, our 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds, but even some of our older students, your 5th graders, 6th graders, high schoolers, if they are struggling with oral language, possibly because of their disability, it's still okay to do some of those activities and those listening activities as even with older students. Don't think just because they're older, they don't need some of these skills anymore. Some of them really will still need these skills. Okay, phonemic skills, again, thinking about, phonics, letters, sound, correspondence, stuff like that. Understanding word parts, syntax, morphology. There's a whole bunch. Again, who would have thought that there are 9 slides for strategies about what to do with for oral language? Word find activities, improving pragmatic skills. There is a lot of research out there saying, hey, do some of these strategies with your students. They're going to help. So again, some listening activities. Teacher says, same or different, last is first. Look in the textbook for more, more thorough descriptions of these activities. But there are lots of activities which is why I really like this textbook. There are lots of activities that your textbook provides as strategies and techniques for teaching oral language skills. Phonemic skills. So thinking back, phonics, right? Letter, sound, correspondence, phonemic awareness, the understanding that spoken words are made up of phonemes or sounds, right? So we want to think about sound matching, sound isolation, sound blending. So maybe you're going to say a word, they blend the sounds together. Then you're going to say a word, they're going to segment. Cat, at, and then blend it back together, cat, right? Okay, I'm going to say the word cat, at. I want you to get rid of the k. What word do you have left? At. Great. This is where making words comes in handy. I think it's, oh gosh, what's her name? Cunningham, but I might be making that up, so don't quote me on that. Word boxes, Elkonin boxes is what some people call them. Elkonin, potato. But those are wonderful activities for some of these sound blending, sound segmentation. Okay, building vocabulary and improve word find. We want to introduce vocabulary words in context. Don't just throw out a vocabulary word to them, especially as your students get older. Introduce those words in context. Why are we learning this word? What does it mean in our context? What's a definition? What is a student-friendly definition in the context of how we're going to use the word, especially math, right? Thinking about math vocabulary. It's its own language, but it's not always explicitly taught. Can you use pictures or real life examples, multiple examples, relate vocabulary words to students' prior knowledge? If you continue on, to take more classes with me, we will talk a lot about vocabulary, I promise, in another class. So come on back. Don't leave us after this class. No, I'm just kidding. We could think about some semantic maps, and we talk about the meaning of language, the set of rules that determine whether certain words can go with other words and still make sense. You could use that. You could make that really fun. Mnemonic strategies, keyword, peg word, you'll learn all about those in math. So again, keep coming back. It's a separate class, not in this class, but we will talk about mnemonic strategies. But think about even some of those easier ones, that we've all learned forever. Roy G. Biv, right? The colors of the rainbow, the planets. I know the planets are subject to change apparently, but there's a mnemonic for that. Visual imagery, really creating pictures in your students' minds, especially for our students who are going to struggle. Okay, we also want to think about providing word cues, associative cues. How can I associate one thing with another? Multiple cues, and using some target words as retrieval cues. Okay, and a couple other techniques: improving pragmatic skills, conversation skills, back and forth. How do you take turns in conversation? Slant is another one. I've talked about this in one of my undergraduate classes, but I wanted to just look this up and give you a definition. It stands for sit up, lean forward, ask and answer. That should say answer question. Well, okay, I guess it could say answers. Nod your head and track the speaker. There's some variations of this, but this is kind of a common one, and here's where I got it from. And also response cards, true, false, yes, no, A, B, C, D, making sure your students are engaged with language. And y'all, this is a record. I finished chapter 5 in one part, So I will see you again for part 6.